We need to compromise and meet somewhere in the middle.
So I say I completely agree with the honourable member, because I, in fact, first proposed a cross-party commission straight after the referendum to oversee the negotiations, and then I proposed it again after the general election, because I was fearful that we would end up in a kind of gridlock, and I thought it would be best done in a way that builds consensus. So I do agree with her the importance of that.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. We wouldn't surely be in this position had the Prime Minister not run down the clock, and we wouldn't be in this position if the Prime Minister had perhaps reached out across the House sooner.
I think we would all... Look, the truth is we've been trying to squeeze into a few days a process of consensus building that really should have taken 2 years, that should have started a long time ago. And that's why I think it's so important to make sure that just at the point at which we are trying to come together and build some consensus, we don't just tumble off the edge of a cliff. We don't just end up doing unfair damage to our constituents. I could wait.
I appreciate the Right Honourable lady is being very generous, and I appreciate the way she's introduced this debate. But may I just gently remind her that predictions have been proved so wrong in the past about the consequences of voting to leave or no deal. We heard dire economic predictions in 2016. By Christmas 2016, 500,000 extra unemployed. The economic reality has been very different since. They were wrong then, and I suggest to the lady they're wrong now.
I think the honourable member is talking about the assessments that were made about the impact on confidence immediately after the referendum itself. That, I think, is a very different assessment from the impact of things like WTO tariffs. I mean, that is something, a really practical thing, where you can see what the impact is going to be of those numbers, or some of the other issues in terms of the border capacity, if you need to do customs checks. Those are very practical things, which have not yet come into place, and I hope will not, because I think frictionless trade is so important to our constituencies. I'll give way one final time.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way, and I'm pleased to co-sponsor her bill today, because actually it has been done on a cross-party basis. It's been done by all people who want to prevent a no deal from happening, because they've been listening to the CBI, the TUC, all of the voices in our constituencies. And whatever our views on where Brexit goes, we all believe we must avoid that catastrophic no deal, and whatever the progress of this bill tonight, this House has resolved to avoid that.
My honourable friend is completely right. And let me just quickly tell you some of the points that have been made to me about why this is so important. No deal would mean we would immediately lose access to the European arrest warrant and access to crucial criminal databases. A Castleford police officer told me that no deal would mean it is going to be incredibly difficult for me to do my job properly. Obviously, with more serious offenders, such as sex offenders, who will travel, this is going to cause serious concern. No deal will also mean the kind of border delays that have led the NHS to have to do stockpiling. A friend told me in Pontefract that he is waiting for radiotherapy for his cancer treatment and does not know if that treatment will be delayed because short-life isotopes cannot be stockpiled. Major manufacturers and producers in our area like Burberry, Haribo, Teva have told me how hard they would be hit by WTO tariffs, by customs checks and by border delays. And I think we should be standing up for British manufacturing abroad and not holding them back. And local small businesses particularly have told me how much they fear if they are dependent on imports. They simply don't have the margins and could end up going bust if their stock is delayed. And local trade unions who have warned about the impact on jobs. And perhaps I fear most of all the impact of no deal on some of the most overstretched families in my constituency, where we've had to set up hungry holiday clubs for kids who are on free school meals who may go hungry in the Easter holidays. And in Airedale, we've had support and free lunches for families, and those families are going to really struggle if there is a 10% hike in food prices, and it is simply not fair on them. I'm going to make some progress first before I give way, because I have given way very many times. And therefore, I think we have a responsibility. I know that there are members across this House and there are people across the country who say they would like to see no deal happen and they would like to see it happen as soon as possible. I would just simply say it will hit other people's lives, and it is not fair. And for the sake of the Castleford police officer, for the sake of the Airedale families, for the sake of the Pontefract and Normanton manufacturers and the small businesses and the cancer patients across the country, that is why I think we do have a responsibility to make sure we have a system in place to prevent no deal on April the 12th, just 9 days away. Let me just say something about the Prime Minister's process first, and then I will give way and have another round of giving away. The Prime Minister has announced her intention to pursue an extension, but the reason for continuing with this bill is because there is no clear process for how those decisions will be taken about the length of extension and the context. And what this bill does, therefore, is it does a few things. First of all, it provides some clarity about how those decisions about the length of the extension will be taken, gives a role for this House in that process. And I think it also ensures that we don't just slip back into facing that no-deal cliff edge almost by accident because of the nature of the difficult conversations and the complexity of what we're all facing. And perhaps crucially, it will demonstrate to the EU parliamentary support for what the Prime Minister is asking for. And to be fair to the EU, given the turbulence we've had in this House at every stage along this process, that actually is quite a reasonable thing for them to ask whether the Prime Minister has the support of the House in the things that she is asking for. I will give way very briefly.
And I congratulate her on her bill and the progress that she's made thus far. She speaks clearly based on evidence, and I'm delighted, as I expected from her, she's clearly listened to business. And would she agree with me that the Secretary of State for Business, we can only assume, has also listened to business, and of course he's looked at the government's own impact assessment of no deal, and he claims it would be ruinous for our country. Does she think he's right?
Well, I think that we should very take seriously that assessment, but not just from the government ministers, but also from the CBI and the TUC, who have come together in, I think, a very powerful way to say very strongly the damage that it would cause for us to be simply left with no deal. And I think, therefore, that many of us have been trying to make this process work, trying to come together, trying to deal, whether it be through proposals that we've made, through select committees for different Brexit policy options, whether it be work that we have done calling for consensus or putting forward indicative votes and options. I think there has been a lot of work done, but where we, I hope, will share our views is that we should avoid that no-deal Brexit. I am conscious of really needing to finish one and then final two, and then I really have to not, because it's not fair for the people.
My honourable lady for giving way, and she knows that I support the broad thrust of this bill, but I'm concerned that it doesn't say when the Prime Minister has to ask for an extension. And it also doesn't seem to provide for the situation where Parliament has asked her to go for an extension longer than the 22nd of May, but she doesn't want to do so. It doesn't seem to have enough teeth to me. Could she address those points?
I think the purpose of it is it does say, it does spell out that on the day after the day on which the Act receives royal assent, the Prime Minister must move the motion in the House of Commons, and it also does provide for the government to be mandated by what it is the House has voted for. This is a two-clause bill. This is a two-clause bill. I will in a second. I will in a second. This is a two-clause bill, and that's all it is. It's very simple. It requires the Prime Minister to put the motion to Parliament proposing an extension to Article 50. It asks the Prime Minister to define in the motion the length of the extension. Parliament can debate the motion, can seek to amend it in the normal way, and the conclusion is binding on the government. The Prime Minister has to take that to the EU. If the EU Council agrees and that is resolved, if the EU Council proposes a different date, the bill proposes for the Prime Minister to come back to the House with a new motion. So the bill simply provides for a simple, practical and transparent process to underpin the Prime Minister's plan. It makes sure the extension has the support of the House of Commons, but also that we keep that parliamentary safeguard in place. So whatever is agreed by any further talks, any further indicative process, or by the Prime Minister's approach, by any of these different options, the Prime Minister herself has said nothing can be implemented by April the 12th. And therefore, in only 9 days' time, the Prime Minister has recognised she cannot implement anything by then, and that is why the extension is needed. And I think, Mr. Speaker, this is, I think, a hugely important bill. I am conscious of allowing other members. The honourable member has been standing up a lot.
For giving way. She's being very generous. Would she agree with me? She's clearly had a conversation with senior police officers. The impact on the European arrest warrant apparently is an average 6 weeks to process cases now, would transfer to an average of 6 months. Would she like to speculate on the impact of that sort of delay in terms of processing very serious cases?
Right, and I've also heard, for example, the ECRIS, the Criminal Records Database, then at the moment they can access criminal records in a matter of days, but actually this could take weeks as a result. We've had that evidence on the Select Committee. I give way.
To the Right Honourable Lady. Just simply a question. Would the Right Honourable Lady be able to tell the House how long the extension will be? Because that is also a matter of principle. It's not just a matter of committee. How long does she expect the words in square brackets to be? Is it going to be 3 months, 9 months, 2 years? What will it be? And secondly, doesn't the Right Honourable Lady agree that it is quite extraordinary that if it was to be an extended period, it would cost the British taxpayer billions and billions of pounds?
Can I very gently just point out that there are 3 front bench speeches to be heard and a number of other honourable and right honourable members who wish to speak in the debate. Therefore, there is a premium upon brevity. Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Speaker. The bill deliberately does not specify because it should be for the Prime Minister to put a proposal forward. The Prime Minister has to go into the EU Council and has to do the negotiating. She also has to lead the process around indicative votes. So I think it is right that she puts that forward and then the House will decide. I am just very conscious of the front benches. I am very conscious of front benches needing to speak. Can I just make my final point? I think there is a real. It's really important for people to come together, both as part of this process and in how we go forward, because the challenges that we face from the threat of no deal are very significant. In my, I think it's 3 years on from the referendum. The biggest problem for all of us is that so little has been done to heal the national Brexit divide or to bring people together. And this is major constitutional change. And if there isn't that effort made to bring people together, then to be honest, whatever we conclude, either today, tomorrow, next week, it won't last because there won't have been that work to build the consensus. I think at the moment we all know there is no agreement and no consensus on the best way forward. We hope we can reach it, but at the moment there is no agreement. Let's at least sustain our agreement about ruling out the worst way forward. I beg to move the bill.
Martin Vickers now.
Well, the question is that the bill be now read a second time. I've just had a message shunted to me from a government whip that the Secretary of State is content to wait for a period, and the honourable gentleman, the member for Cleethorpes, is the beneficiary. Mr Martin Vickers.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I was only just beginning to write my speech, but I'll muddle along. Needless to say, Mr Speaker, as a almost lifelong Brexit supporter, I'm speaking against the proposal. I recognise that across the House there are members who quite genuinely did not want to leave the EU. They believe that the best interests of our country lies as a member of that union, and that's a perfectly honourable position. But what I find objectionable is those who are quite deliberately seeking to frustrate the will of the British people, so clearly demonstrated in June 2016. And in my particular constituency, there was a 70% vote to leave. I'm pleased about that because, of course, I was one of them, and I have campaigned long and hard to achieve this. In fact, I know I don't look old enough, but I did actually vote in the 1975 referendum, and of course I voted to leave on that occasion. And that was I'll happily give way to my neighbour.
I thank you for giving way. Is it not the case, though, that many of our constituents who, as he says, voted by a margin of 70% to leave the European Union, now think that what's happening, and this is the problem with bills like this, is that there is a stitch-up taking place to try to deny the result of the referendum? And it's all perfectly fine, people talking about people coming together. But when legislation is put forward to deny a way of leaving the EU by people who are on the other side of the campaign, our constituents only feel more that this place is out of touch with them and that this is all one massive stitch-up.
Yeah, absolutely. My honourable friend and neighbour is absolutely right in his analysis of the situation. And moving on, if those who, for example, are arguing for a second referendum, a so-called people's vote, as if it wasn't people who voted on the last occasion, I'll give way one more time to my honourable friend.
Your neighbour, but it's very. Thank you very much for actually letting me intervene. I would actually very much agree with him that we've had a people's vote. And that happened in 2016. I actually voted and campaigned Remain, but I believe we must respect that vote and we must get on and leave the European Union. And lots of people on the other side are just thwarting it, even though in their manifesto they actually were campaigning to leave the European Union as well.
Thank you. I thank my honourable friend for that, and although he's not my neighbour, he is of course welcome to visit Cleethorpes at any time, and he will be made most welcome. I was moving on to talk about a second referendum and the uncertainty and division that will actually continue. Are those members who think it will resolve the issue seriously suggesting that if we were to have a rerun and a lower turnout, that perhaps a scenario could unfold where 16.4 million people voted to remain, and because it was a lower turnout, they actually won? Now, do you think that would satisfy the 17.4 million who in 2016 voted to leave? Of course not. It would continue. It would continue the division and uncertainty, and we would be battling on for another 20, 30 years about our future in Europe. I think what you've got to remember is that to a great extent it was an emotional vote by people. We had Project Fair that told them they were going to be worse off, that taxes were going to rise within days, hours even, of a decision. In actual fact, they said, well, that's fine, let's look at that, but we want to leave not because of some potential downturn in our economy, but because it's a cultural issue. Our history, our structure of government in Parliament, our judicial processes are different, and we were having to make more and more changes to our established processes. Well, I'll give way first to the Honourable Lady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful for my honourable friend giving way. The vote itself was on our membership of the EU. It was not about our future relationship. All those emotional matters that my honourable friend raises may well have been sold to them during the campaign, but the vote itself was about our membership and therefore cannot be prayed in aid in terms of how it shapes our future relationship.
I strongly disagree with my honourable friend. They voted to leave the structure of the economic union, and they wanted to slam the door closed. They wanted a clean break with it. They weren't thinking about our future relationship. They said we've had enough with the existing relationship. I give way to my honourable friend.
My honourable friend is making an excellent speech. I mean, what he also, I'm sure, will agree with is that in addition to the emotion, actually they were proved right, because despite all the predictions of doom and gloom in 2016, the economic reality since is that we've had a strong period of economic growth, and those investment decisions have been made in the full knowledge that we could be leaving on no-deal WTO terms.
That's right. I entirely agree with my honourable friend. So we move on. They made that decision to leave, and they expected us to be leaving, and they certainly expected us to be leaving a lot quicker than 3 years. Now, it is suggested that if we go back and rerun the referendum and so on, it will all people will change their mind because of the economic arguments and so on. The reality, I think, is very different, and I think we should recognise that, as I recall the Attorney General saying in one of his outings in the House on this issue, this has now come down to a political decision, and the political decision should follow the result of the referendum. And I think there will be an enormous backlash against not just the party in power, but the political classes. If as the people see, they see the door in front of us marked exit, and we are seen not to step through it. And I would urge the House to vote against this and to continue the battle. And if we end up with no deal, then so be it.
Thank you. I would like to encourage colleagues to make speeches not exceeding 3 minutes. In fact, there will be a 3-minute limit on backbench speeches. The front benches are going to be encouraged to be extremely brief. Lots of people want to speak, very little time. Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to lend my support to this important bill because I think it's a vital safety net to ensure that we don't crash out with no deal next week and that we have enough time to find a constructive way forward. Many others have already spoken very passionately about the impact that no deal would have on business. Also, they've spoken about the impact on some of the most vulnerable, and of course, no deal would affect the poorest communities hardest. I wanted to say a few words about two areas. One, about how I think that if we don't pass this bill, we do put at risk the Good Friday Agreement. We do risk greater insecurity and tension in Northern Ireland, and I think that is absolutely a criminal thing to do. I am inordinately shocked, even knowing what I know, that 14 members of the Cabinet appear to be positively enthusiastic about leaving with no deal. I can't think of anything more irresponsible. But I want to say a few words about environmental protection as well, because no deal is a disaster for our environment. It would lead to a huge governance gap where not only do we not have the environmental policies which have been key to protecting our environment in this country, which have come from Brussels, but we would also lack the enforcement agencies that are absolutely crucial to making them go forward. I'm not going to, just because I've been told I've only got 3 minutes. There are huge further concerns about no deal, crossing everything from security to medicines to fissile materials to pharmaceuticals. I want to point something else out about trade agreements to you, because we often hear on the other side that somehow when we're outside of the EU, when we've crashed out, it's going to make it easier for us to make these trade deals. I would put it to them that if they're looking at us as a potentially trustworthy partner in a trade deal, are they really going to want to conduct trade deals with a partner that has crashed out of the EU and which has presumably not even paid its divorce bill either? I think this would make us look incredibly untrustworthy. And finally, let's not have all of this stuff about how there's some kind of stitch-up to prevent us leaving the EU. Those people on the other side can't possibly say what was in the minds of those people who voted leave nearly 3 years ago. But what we do know was that, in fact, it was 37% of the electorate, and it was nearly 3 years ago, and that no ballot was not on the ballot paper at that referendum. How on earth can we be taking such far-reaching actions that would cause such damage to our constituents and to our environment on the basis of an electorate that was little over a third nearly 3 years ago? At the very least, Mr. Speaker, this absolutely has to go back to the people. We can't possibly be pretending to be acting in their name unless we have the courtesy to go back to them and check this is what they meant. And frankly, from everything that I know, from the people that I've been speaking to up and down this country, they did not mean the amount of devastation and destruction that will be caused to this country by crashing out of the EU with no deal, which is why this bill is so important.
Thank you. John Barron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do find it very strange, this sort of condescending view that people didn't know what they voted for first time round, so we're going to give them a second vote, and if we don't like that result, we'll give them a third and a fourth. It is complete nonsense. No, because we've been told to be brief, and I'm going to be brief, and we've been guided by Mr. Speaker on this. Can I just ask the House just to reflect for a moment and use moderation when it comes to this issue about so-called crashing out or falling off a cliff by leaving on no-deal WTO terms. I would gently remind the House that in 2016 there were lots of dire predictions about what would happen if we voted to leave. We had predictions from the trade bodies, the business organisations, from the government, the Treasury front bench. We had predictions of 500,000 extra unemployed by Christmas 2016. The CBI came out with a figure of 950,000 extra unemployed within a couple of years. They all proved wrong. So much so that the Bank of England actually had to apologise. Now, what has happened since? We've had record low unemployment, record inward investment, and record manufacturing output. And I suggest to the House that the reason we've had that is because economic reality, trade, and comparative advantage trumps predictions. And when we talk about comparative advantage, it's factors such as how low are our corporation tax rates compared to other countries? How much more flexible are our labour markets? What about our financial expertise, unrivalled certainly within Europe? Our R&D, our top universities. It is these issues, these factors, which in aggregate are more important than WTO tariffs and leaving on no deal. And the proof of the pudding is in the economic reality. Our unemployment rate, and we would all agree a low unemployment rate is terribly important. High unemployment is one of the social evils in our society. But our unemployment rate is nearly half that of the EU average. And this is the issue in point. And we trade with many countries outside the EU very profitably on WTO no-deal terms. So I would suggest to the House that if we want to respect the referendum result, the triggering of Article 50 and our own election manifestos, then we should be leaving the EU on the 12th of April on no-deal WTO terms if we can't agree a deal before then.
Mr. Brake, no? Tom Brake.
I really just wanted to say a few words about a conversation I had earlier today with business representatives from, amongst other places, Northern Ireland, for instance, who were very worried about the
European Union Withdrawal number 5 bill.
Absolutely.
Yes. Tom Brake.
Specifically on the issue of no deal and the impact, which clearly is what this bill is about, ruling out the possibility of no deal, and their concerns around the impact of VAT being applied. But they went much beyond that in terms of the impact of no deal on Northern Ireland and the impact on security, for instance, and the issue that I referred to earlier in terms of the impact on things like the European arrest warrant. And for no deal, the impact on things like labelling and the uncertainties around whether, for a company that manufactures here but also has shops in other parts of Europe, whether they need to change the labelling. So clearly, the impact of no deal goes far beyond just some of the issues that have been raised here today. And I hope that what this bill will provide is some clarity on the issue of the extension. Clearly, I'm quite open in believing that extension needs to be a lengthy extension, the sort of extension that businesses were talking to me about earlier today. And that is one way of ruling out no deal. There was just one final point that I wanted to mention, which was just on the question of, I think, the point that was made by the spokesperson for the Greens, and that is on the issue of the legitimacy of the vote of 3 years ago, and specifically the way that trade union legislation, as I understand it, requires ballots to be rerun after 6 months' time to ensure that they are valid and that the views that were expressed in a ballot 6 months earlier are valid 6 months on. And clearly that is something which I think could equally apply to a ballot, if I can put it that way, that took place 3 years ago. So I do hope that we will allow this bill to proceed through the second reading. I know there are a number of amendments at committee stage, one of which indeed applies to a people's vote, and I hope that we will get to debate that shortly as well.
Antoinette Sandbach.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I rise to support this bill for this reason. We are seeing the revisionism of history by ERG members who claim that 17.4 million people voted for no deal. That is not what was on the ballot paper. What was on the ballot paper was our membership of the EU. Many of us in this House have triggered Article 50 on the basis that what we were doing was saying to the EU we will not remain a full member, but we want to have a new relationship with you, one that might look like Norway, one that might look like Switzerland. We may be in EFTA, but that, in fact, that was campaigned for on the campaign trail by Vote Leave. And Vote Leave's electoral registration made it absolutely clear that the decision of the future relationship would be up to Parliament, that what voters were voting for was to leave the political institutions of the EU out of the ECJ, out of the ever closer union, but not ruling out the single market or the customs union. So why has this House ruled out no deal? It's because we have faced the reality of what leaving with no deal would look like. We are due to do that in just over a week with no process in place. And if we are to change that, we need to change the law. And Parliament has voted by 400 votes to 160 against no deal. This bill is not undemocratic. It implements that decision. We have not ruled out leaving the EU. We are still leaving other options open for our future relationship. And I am somebody who has supported the Prime Minister's deal 3 times. I have voted on behalf of my constituents to implement their decision in the referendum. The problem is that there are a hardcore of ideological WTOers that want to hold this House to ransom and want to hold the country to ransom. And I have distressed businesses saying we must resolve this. I have employers who live in my constituency. I'm sorry, he spoke so many... no, I'm so sorry. I have really distressed employers in my constituency who are responsible for thousands of employees that would like a resolution. And what this does is give Parliament, this bill gives Parliament a proper say in the event that we cannot get to a resolution in the timeframes currently set out. So far from being undemocratic, this is about putting a process in place that allows us to implement a decision, that allows us to have time to look at the best way we can implement our future relationship with Europe. And that is why I shall be voting for it.
Used to 2 minutes. Joanna Cherry.
Mr. Speaker, it's a real pleasure to follow the honourable member for Edinburgh, who has been one of the voices of sanity on the government benches throughout this debacle. Others, I'm afraid, are living in cloud cuckoo land if they still believe that no deal is not going to be a disaster for the economy of these islands. In my constituency of Edinburgh South West, we have the second biggest financial sector in the United Kingdom. We have 2 major universities, Heriot-Watt and Napier, and I have many businesses, small and large, that are very concerned about the impact of a no-deal Brexit. And of course, Mr. Speaker, my constituents didn't vote for Brexit at all. 72% of them voted to remain in the European Union. So I support the general principle of this bill. I have to say that I think it has some serious shortcomings, but it's all we have at the moment. It's the only insurance policy we have at the moment against a no-deal Brexit. I would have preferred to have seen something with far more teeth in it, such as the proposal I put forward on Monday. And I do have a number of questions about this bill which have yet to be answered. I'm worried that the bill does not say when the Prime Minister has to ask for an extension of time. The European Council is next Wednesday. It doesn't say specifically when she has to ask, whether she has to ask before then or on that day, nor does it say what happens if the European Council give us an extension with conditions attached, such as a longer extension, and nor does it say what happens if the Prime Minister won't contemplate extending beyond the 22nd of May, but Parliament has forced her to ask for a longer extension. It seems to imply she could sit on her hands. So I think it's right for a bit of amendment, this bill, and certainly the SNP will be trying to lay some amendments if we get to that stage. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to call each of the 2 remaining members, but each will have no more than 2 minutes, and the honourable gentleman must be reseated by 6:50. Okay. Sir William Cash.
Very briefly indeed, Mr. Speaker. I just want to make one point which I have referred to briefly before, and it is this. This entire process, as my European Scrutiny Committee report made clear, back in March last year, is being driven by the guidelines and the humiliating supplication of the European Union by the government and the Prime Minister. That is true and it is clear. Furthermore, what happened with the reversal of the position on Chequers when the Withdrawal Act itself, which had been overtaken by events, was then on a pre-planned basis, then turned into a new arrangement which became the withdrawal agreement. The final point I want to make is this, that with regard to supplicating the EU, there is a profound humiliation for the British people in our being required to do what they say. And what this bill will do will be to ensure that they dictate the terms and the basis on which that will be done, as Sir Paul Lever and I and others have made clear over the years, it will be decided by Germany in the Council of Ministers and in the European Council. He says, and I say, this is a German Europe, it is run by Germany, and that is the bottom line, and that will happen in relation to this decision as well.
Well, that is one of the shortest speeches the honourable gentleman has ever delivered in the chamber. 2 minutes, Mr Bob Seeley.
Much indeed, Mr Speaker. I will not be supporting this bill, the European Union Withdrawal No. 5 bill, because it is delay without end. Business above all wants certainty. I don't believe all the scare stories. The Treasury, sadly, has been proved wrong in most of its assessments of Brexit. And this bill is simply going to be the water torture of endless delay. I make my decision-making on 2 points. Firstly, we have to honour the referendum result. That means voting for Brexit. I do so because the country voted for it. I do so because my island, the Isle of Wight, voted for it. I do so because the best way of improving the reputation of politics is for politicians to do what we said we would do. And the problem is that we are not doing that. And this chaos is self-induced by people who do not want Brexit. Second, we have to live in the real world, and that means accepting that this Parliament has a Remain majority. It has been obvious for months that we were not going to get a no deal through, and whilst I respect the Right Honourable Member for Stone and many other Brexiteer colleagues, I cannot think of a more perfect example of snatching defeat from the jaws of an acceptable victory. There has never been a chance to get no deal through, as we are finding out. We are not theologians. We need to cut a deal, not philosophise on the nature of Brexit perfection. I do not think, thank you, I do not think, I'm so flattered to be criticised by both sides, I know I'm right. I do not think this deal is too bad. I think the alternatives on the Strictly Come Brexit dance-off next week will be another well-meaning shambles, and what is truly obvious at this stage, mind-numbingly, stupefyingly obvious, that if we want a deal and we want to leave with a deal, we should vote for one. Thank you.
Mr Peter Grant.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. On the 18th of July 2018, the SNP became the first party in this Parliament to call for an extension of Article 50 deadline. The need for that extension, and a real extension, is more urgent now than it was then. So although we have a number of concerns about the wording of the bill, we will compromise on those concerns just now, support the bill and hopefully improve it at the next stage. Mr Speaker, the Government are still trying to blackmail this House by insisting that it's a choice between the Prime Minister's rotten deal and no deal at all. That claim is simply not true. Revocation is still an option. We will be hoping to amend the bill to make that perfectly clear. I commend my honourable learned friend for the part she played in confirming that. In a court case in which Her Majesty's Government spent £150,000 of our money sending lawyers to the European Court just to tell the court they didn't have a view on the matter under discussion, which seemed a good use of money. And ironically, possibly the best way in the long term to get the Brexit that people actually voted for would be to stop this insane process and start all over again before it's too late. I was disappointed that Labour didn't fully support that motion when my honourable friend put it forward previously. I think it was a mistake. I hope they'll accept it as a mistake and support it if they get the chance again. We do have a concern the bill at the moment leaves too much in the hands of a Prime Minister who can't be trusted to get anything right, so we'll be seeking to get that amended as well. We also need to have a clear reason for the extension, and that will dictate how long the extension has to be. Our preference would be to have an extension to allow a people's vote, not a rerun of a referendum in 2016, but a different vote at a different time on a different question. If the government were confident that their withdrawal agreement had the support of the people, they wouldn't be running away so quickly from the chance to give the people the say on that. Mr Speaker, this morning, or earlier this afternoon, my honourable friend from Roskilde and Lochaber held up a copy of Scotland's Place in Europe, and it was held out by the Conservatives in this House. But, Mr Speaker, they can laugh at Scotland's Place in Europe. Scotland's place is in Europe, and Scotland is about to retain its proper place as a full sovereign member of the family of European nations.
Thank you. Mr Paul Blomfield.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and our thanks too to the Right Honourable Member for Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford and the Right Honourable Member for West Dorset for their work on this bill and the way that they've introduced both the business motion and the bill itself to the House. We support this bill because it's necessary to fulfil the wishes of the House, which has voted down the Prime Minister's deal on 3 occasions and has voted against leaving without a deal on 3 occasions. Very briefly.
Can you think of another example when the TUC and the CBI have been as emphatic as they have been about the dangers of a no-deal Brexit?
I can't, and that underlines the importance of this bill, which provides for the further extension of Article 50, which is now inevitable, and it offers a legislative framework through which the House can have an effective role in the process of determining that extension. Now, clearly, the bill sits in the new context of the Prime Minister's statement late last night, saying that she was seeking talks with my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, and those talks which have begun. We welcome what the Right Honourable Member for Grantham described as a late conversion to compromise, although we regret the damage that has been done both to the economy and to the credibility of this House by her not doing so sooner. It's an approach that she should have adopted long ago, almost 3 years ago after the referendum, when the country decided by a painfully narrow margin to leave the EU, but not to rupture our relations with our closest neighbours, key allies and most important trading partners. She could have done it after the election, when she went to the country saying Parliament was obstructing her and seeking a mandate for a hard Brexit, and she lost her majority and failed to get the mandate. And she could have done it on any of the 3 occasions when her deal was defeated by the House. But she chose not to. We have, Mr Speaker, consistently called on her to reach out to the sensible majority in this House and to unite the country, recognising that the people of this country include both the 52% and the 48%. But better late than never. We also welcome the way that the Prime Minister distanced herself last night from those Camicazi colleagues who, as she said, would like to leave with no deal next week. This House has expressed its clear view on leaving without a deal, and this bill provides the legislative lock to ensure that the will of our sovereign Parliament is not frustrated. It also provides the flexibility to ensure that we can accommodate whatever comes from the discussions between our parties and across the House over the next few days. We have set out clearly the framework on which we will be seeking a compromise that the Prime Minister talked about last night: a permanent and comprehensive customs union, close alignment with a single market, dynamic alignment on rights and protections, clear commitments on participation in EU agencies and funding programmes, and unambiguous agreements on future security arrangements. And we've been clear in our support for a confirmatory public vote on any deal that comes about at this very late stage. We look forward to the further discussions on these issues, and we're pleased to give our full backing to this bill.
Visiting the European Union, Stephen Barclay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We will oppose this bill. It is passed in haste, and the fact we have a time limit of 2 minutes for a number of the speeches this evening is an indication of the fact that the bill is being passed in haste. It is constitutionally irregular. And it also fails, frankly, to understand the decision-making process by which any discussion of an extension or agreement on an extension at the EU Council will be reached, and I will come on to that in the limited time that I have. It's not just myself, Mr. Speaker, that has concerns with this bill on behalf of the government, but objections to the bill have been raised by the chairs of the European Scrutiny Committee, my honourable friend the member for Stone, by the chair of the Procedure Committee, my honourable friend the member for Broxbourne, and indeed by the Public Administration and Constitutional Committee chair, the member for Harwich and North Essex. All have raised concern with the bill. In particular, the fact that this is being rushed through in such short order, and indeed the precedent this sets for not just this government, but also for successive governments. It also calls into question, Mr. Speaker, the royal prerogative, as it has been a long-standing practice that heads of government are able to enter international agreements without preconditions set by the House, which constrain their ability to negotiate in the national interest. Let me give you an example of how that constraint could actually have an adverse effect, particularly given that the House has voted against no deal, how it could increase the risk of an accidental no deal. For example, on Wednesday the 10th of April, the European Union could propose at the Council an extension of an alternative length. Yet under the bill, the Prime Minister must then return to this House on Thursday the 11th of April to put that proposal to the House. But by the 11th of April, the European Council will have concluded, the leaders will have returned to their member states. And so we would then need to confirm the UK's agreement to the decision of the European Council and get the European Council's approval to that by 11 p.m. on April the 12th. And I think what's at the heart of this is the fact that last Friday, in voting against the withdrawal agreement, which was the only legal right this House had to an extension to the 22nd of May, which was at the heart, Mr. Speaker, as I understand it, of your decision to grant that vote, because, as the Attorney-General set out, that was an additional right bestowed on the House as a result of that previous EU Council. We have no automatic right to a legal extension. That right was foregone by the decision of the House last Friday, and yet this bill puts the House in the position of having to agree after the European Council has concluded, and those leaders have returned to their member states. Of course I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
And he is very generous in giving way. Who ran down the clock?
Well, I think it's not usually my practice to quote the front page of The Guardian, but I suspect it is the newspaper of choice of the Honourable Gentleman. And we all remember the headline. Indeed, it was quoted by many EU leaders, which said no, 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 because this House has failed to agree on the various options. The Prime Minister has sought to compromise. Indeed, part of the challenge she has had with her deal is because people on both wings of this debate feel it is too much of a compromise. So the Prime Minister has sought to compromise in the national interest, reflecting the fact, as members have said, 48% of the public didn't vote to leave. And that is why the Prime Minister has sought compromise. It is why she sought to reach out to the Leader of the Opposition, but he refused to meet her for several weeks. Indeed, he even refused to meet when Chuka Umunna, the member for Streatham, happened to be in the room. This was apparently beyond the pale. I'm pleased that today I was able to join the Prime Minister at a meeting with the Leader of Opposition. But when it comes, as the Honourable Gentleman says, to running down the clock, it is the fact that the House has consistently voted for what it is against, not what it is for. And indeed, the decision the House took on Friday not to approve the withdrawal agreement was the very essence of running down the clock. Because what it did, I've only got a minute left, what it did was it waived the right that we had to an extension to the 22nd of May, and therefore only gave an extension to the 12th. That is the very essence of running down the clock, and the Honourable Gentleman voted for that reduction in time. A very odd thing, Mr. Speaker, to criticise a reduction in time whilst having voted for the very reduction to which he complains. But given that we are passing this bill in haste, given that we don't have adequate time to debate this in the manner to which I would like, given there is only a minute left on the clock, there are problems with the speed of this passage, there are problems with the constitutional principle of it, there is problems with the way operationally it will interact with any decision reached by the Council that differs from the earlier decision taken by this House. So I hope the constitutional experts in the other place will address some of the flaws that are contained in this bill. But it is because of those defects that this government will oppose the bill tonight, and I urge other honourable and right honourable members of this House to oppose this defective bill.
Under the order of the House of today, I am now required to put the question. The question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No! Division! Clear the lobby. The question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Tellers for the ayes, Jeff Smith and Nick Smith. Tellers for the noes, Wendy Morton and Craig Whittaker.